Will they know? Will you please make sure that everybody knows they can come in?
Tammy, come on in. My info.
Yeah, everybody come in. Sydney, Susan, make sure everybody knows they can come in. I don't want somebody standing there as though it looks like people can't come in. It's almost like a bodyguard.
Everyone in the house.
Well, yeah.
Everyone get in here.
Yeah. Please make sure everybody knows they can come in.
Costa, and I am the owner of Synergy Yoga, the proud owner of our yoga home here in Rockville, South Carolina. Yes, thank you so much. And with what good fortune and good energy that we have in our space, that we were invited to host Marianne. So thank you so much for being here, Marianne.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Sarah. It's an honor to be here. And a real exciting opportunity that we can talk about the things we're talking about today in this space. Not just this space physically, but this space energetically and attitudinally. Mahatma Gandhi said that politics should be sacred. And when he said that, he wasn't saying it should be about religion as in dogma or doctrine. That's not what he meant. He meant that we should approach politics from a sacred place within ourselves. The same kind of sacred place that people seek to achieve in a yoga studio, in a church, in a synagogue, in a mosque, in an AA meeting, in any place where we are seeking something within ourselves that is wiser, more reflective, and more deep than we associate often with normal waking consciousness. Einstein said we would not solve the problems of the world from the level of thinking that we were at when we created them. And the problems of the world are very big today. And yet the conversation that dominates our politics is very narrow, it is very superficial, and it is corrupted by some of the concerns that should be considered the least applicable to deep problem solving. Now, this has created all manner of problem. On one hand, it's made some of the deepest thinkers so turned off that some of the people that we need most engaged in our collective problem solving have chronically disengaged from politics. A lot of people who are interested in the most enlightened thinking look at politics for the very reason I said, the entire level of conversation, and thought it's so toxic, I don't want anything to do with it. And that has only made that situation more toxic because it hasn't been infused enough with some of the deepest thinking. And then the more toxic it became, the more people seeking a more enlightened perspective wanted nothing to do with it. Now, I don't tell you where this has gotten us. I don't need to tell you where this has gotten us. To the point now where masses of Americans are going, whoa, 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 we have to do something. So you're here today, and you feel like millions of Americans that we know we have to address politics now. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know we have a crisis of our democracy. We've really got to do something. People know that. But that should not mean we have to sacrifice the more enlightened perspective that so many of us have embraced in order to go into politics, considering the fact that politics, the way it is what got us into this problem to begin with. So what needs to happen is that we need to transform the political conversation itself. And that's why I love having these conversations in yoga studios, in churches, in religious places of worship, and I feel the same way in colleges and universities where new ideas are being incubated. Basically, what we're talking about here is the fact that this is the 21st century, and our political establishment has not gotten that memo yet. Now, the 21st century is a different mental filter than the 20th century. It is like the 20th was different than the 19th. There's nothing odd about that. That's how humanity moves forward. The American people are ready for that. The American people are not the problem. That's what I've learned about all this. I've learned in my experience at campaigning that the political system is even more corrupt than I feared, but the American people are even more wonderful than I knew. The American people are fine. That's not where the problem lies. The American people are generative, we're regenerative, we do new things. We were born out of a revolution. We were born out of the idea that we're not doing that anymore. We're going to do it another way. That's in our DNA. And every great movement forward, from abolition to women's suffrage to civil rights, has been that. Has been people saying, no, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to do something else now. That's wrong, and we're not going to do it anymore, and we're going to do something else that we're going to come up with. That's the American spirit. And you see it in education, and you see it in religion and spirituality. You see it in health and wellness. You see it in business. You see it in so many areas. But you don't see that spirit in politics, because politics is an entrenched system where perpetuating the status quo is the name of the game. In every other area, we're after results. So if something's not working on Wednesday, you make sure you change it by Saturday. But in politics, it wasn't working Wednesday, well, we'll do it again. But it didn't work Wednesday, and it's not going to work Thursday, and it's not going to work Friday. Okay, they say, we'll tweak it a little. And you know what? Tweaking it a little is not going to transform this country. We have to go deep. We have to go real. Now, I'm running for president. As you know, I'm about 1,736 people who are running. And they're all really cool, and they're all really good, and they're all very nice people, and they're all telling you the truth. What I'm saying to you, however, is we have to do more than tell the truth. We have to do what you have to do in a court of law, where you raise your hand and you swear to tell the truth, and the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. We need a level of truth-telling now that we don't normally associate with politics. We need the kind of truth-telling that happens when you go to therapy. The kind of truth-telling when you get down with a lover or a friend or a spouse and you say, we've really got to talk. We need the kind of truth-telling that is the way, whether it's a company or a family system or anything else, people know we're going to have to get real, and we're going to have to say some things that aren't we're going to talk about some things that aren't necessarily fun to talk about, and we're not going to necessarily agree, so we're going to have to be real careful to have our nonviolent communication skills together. And we have to get deep, and we have to get real. What?
Communication skills.
What did you say? I'm sorry.
Could you repeat that? What kind of
Nonviolent communication skills. Oh, that. And what I have learned working for 35 years, up close and personal, with people whose lives are in crisis, and also being a human being who's had my own crises, is that if you do what I just said, you really are willing to look in the mirror, and you take a brutally honest look at yourself, and you, as they say in AA, admit your own character defects, and take your own serious moral inventory, and you atone for what you need to atone for, and you make amends where you need to make amends, and you're willing to change in some places where you know you need to change, and you're not going to whine and bitch and moan and make it about other people, and instead rise to the occasion and claim a new kind of future by claiming a better place within yourself, situations do change. That's how people change. And all that a nation is a group of people. So if a nation is going to change, then the nation has to take the same brutally honest look in the mirror. Now, one of the things with traditional politics, they don't want us to take an honest look in the mirror because they're afraid that you might see them as negative and you wouldn't want to vote for them. And so it's a politics of people pleasing, where they figure out what you want to hear. I'm not here for that. That to me is not leadership. Leadership is where somebody tells you what that person feels really needs to be said, what we really need to talk about. Not necessarily what's fun to talk about, not necessarily what gives you what you want today. It's just like it might save the country, save the democracy, have the planet for our children and children's children to be habitable, that. And I find that the American people, we are good people. We're decent people. I'm not saying we're better than other people. I don't think we're better than other people, but I think we're good. I think we're decent. And I'll tell you something else that I've learned being around so many people whose lives were in trouble. What I've seen, and it's counterintuitive, but what I've seen over and over is when people hear bad news, that's when people become their most intelligent. So politics says, oh, don't tell people that it might scare them. No, 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 no. We're adults. We're not children. And that's part of what's happened in politics. The citizenry has been infantilized. Like we've farmed out our deep thinking. There's no deep thinking going on there. I remember after one of the debates, I read somewhere, Marianne Williamson was out of her depth at that debate. And I thought to myself, there is so no depth going on there. There was no depth going on there. Right? There was no depth there. But we really need to have an in-depth conversation. And what will happen in this country when we do is that this country will change. It's going to take some time. We're going to have to get deep. We're going to have to get real. We will transform. And on the other side of that, we will have the greatest chapter in American history yet. Won't it be extraordinary when we know that our fingerprints are on that? So, this is not a conversation, you know, I don't have a different conversation with white people than with black people or brown people. I don't have a different conversation with rich people or poor people. I don't have a conversation with gay people or straight people. That's not the level of conversation that's going to move us forward. We need to have an American conversation. We need to remember you're black and American, you're Jewish and American, you're gay and American. Right now, we really have to have, in addition to all of those conversations, of course it's important. The Jews have to have a conversation about things about Jews. Blacks have to have a conversation about things about blacks. This is not in any way to minimize the conversations that we have to have within our own communities, cultures, and ethnicities. But we must not forget, we also have some conversations that have to be the conversations we're having as Americans. So, where are we as a country? Well, let's look at some facts. We've got 93 million people in the richest country in the world, and that's almost 1/3 of our citizens living with chronic economic anxiety. And that is due to the fact that that many people live near poverty. We have between 39 and 43 million people living in poverty, and up to 93 million people living near poverty. You know, there's a lot of conversation these days about mental health issues, but I have a really great idea. Why don't we stop driving so many people crazy? Why don't we stop creating conditions that make chronic tension and anxiety and even depression almost inevitable? Because if you live every single day not knowing what would happen if you got sick, not knowing what would happen if you had an unexpected $500 expense, not knowing what would happen if one of your children got sick, not knowing how you will ever send the children that you love to college, not knowing how you will ever get out from underneath these college loans. Look how insidious this is. So the political establishment talks to you about providing mental health because they don't want to talk about the cause, because if we talk about the cause, we see how much the public policy that they created or the public policy that they have not created is at cause for all these mental health issues. Now, I'm not saying those are the only causes of mental health issues. There are obviously other issues. But we are making a mistake by underestimating how much these collective societal and economic conditions contribute to the societal dysfunction that we see all around us. Now, that right there shows how important economics is. Now, we had none of this wealth inequality stuff going on in the 1970s. In the 1980s, an economic theory called trickle-down economics took hold. It took hold of our government, and some of us are nodding because we're old enough to remember the radical changes that this brought about. Now, for those of you who are young, I'm not romanticizing or glamorizing or whitewashing what American capitalism was before the 80s. I'm not saying it was perfect, but believe it or not, the U.S. corporation before the 80s was expected to care. So if somebody, let's say, had worked for a company for decades, the social consensus was such that the company was supposed to care whether or not that person had a dignified retirement. You'd think that didn't matter much, but it does. It means that the social order was one in which the idea that we should care for each other was an accepted truth. Now, that also meant, in other ways that we'll be talking about here today, it's not like America always did the right thing. Nobody can say America always did the right thing. But before that time, the social consensus was we were supposed to try. We got that we were supposed to try. I'll give you an example. There was this thing called the My Lai Massacre during the Vietnam War, where American soldiers massacred a village, basically. Well, the whole country hung its head in shame. We got, no, America's not supposed to do that. But right now, for the sake of $360 billion in an arms sale to this murderous crown prince in Saudi Arabia, we're giving aerial support to a genocidal war that Saudi Arabia is waging against Yemen. Tens of thousands of people in Yemen have starved, many of them children whose pictures are all over the internet, and we're not talking about it. It's like not even conversation. We have become so disconnected from conscience when it comes to the public sphere. Now, we're not disconnected from conscience or integrity or concerned about what's the right thing to do or love or forgiveness in our personal lives. That, I don't think we're different than anybody else. I think the average American, and I'm sure that includes everybody here, does want to do the right thing. It does say to somebody next to you, do you think I did the right thing? Do you think I was too harsh? Do you think, I mean, should I just forgive? I mean, do you think I'm being discerning or judgmental? I mean, these are the kinds of things the average American does discuss. But we have withdrawn that level of inquiry from the public sphere. We've farmed it out. We think, well, we say things like, I'm not political. Or we come up with justification like the one before, which is, it's so toxic, or whatever it is. Now, there's talk about toxic. I'll tell you the toxic brew. When this economic theory, a new economic theory that exploded onto the scene in the 1980s, it had a president, it had Congress, it had huge amounts of money and power behind it. And it was the idea that the company does not owe ethical or moral responsibility to people. That all that the U.S. corporation should owe is financial, they call it fiduciary responsibility, to its stockholders. Even if that's at the expense of the worker or the community or the environment. Now, something that's very interesting, actually, is that a man named Milton Friedman, who was the main, and this all came out of, they were called the Chicago Boys. It came out of the School of Economics at the University of Chicago. But it's interesting to note that Milton Friedman, who himself was the main articulator of this theory, he himself said, but you have to have a universal basic income to make this safe. Isn't that interesting? But they left that part out. Yeah. So what happened was you have this idea of an amoral. Now this is interesting because those of us who are interested in personal transformation, in psychotherapy, and spirituality can see how this happened. It wasn't an immoral system. It's simply an amoral system. So that economic system is not filled with people who wake up in the morning and say, how can I hurt inner city children? It's not a system that wakes up in the morning and says, how can I hurt indigenous tribes? It's not filled with people who wake up in the morning and say, how can I desecrate the earth? It is simply filled with people who feel they're justified in not thinking about those things one way or the other. So you say, well, who's supposed to care about that? Government. Because government, according to Declaration of Independence, government, according to Declaration of Independence, is instituted to secure the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But what happened was that that theory says that fiduciary responsibility to the stockholders, as opposed to all the other stakeholders, and we're all stakeholders in what happens in corporate America, not just people who work in a particular company, that should not only be the way corporations can operate, but that government should keep its hands out so that more money can be made. They called it job-killing regulations. I read a big article this morning. We're all learning about the Boeing disasters because all the teeth had been taken out of the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, and Boeing got to do whatever it wanted because Boeing would make more money. Same thing with the opioid crisis. All the teeth taken out of the Food and Drug Administration so that the Sackler family and all the predatory pharmaceutical executives were selling OxyContin that you look at now. Of course, they're all being indicted because they were over-prescribing, over-manufacturing. Why? So that they could make more money. So more money for corporations became our bottom line. And then it only got worse because these corporations could spend so much money giving donations to politicians that for all intents and purposes, by the 90s, we had a situation where the government had become more an advocate for short-term profits for corporations than advocates for our safety and our health and our well-being, and the safety and health and well-being of our children, and the safety and well-being of the people of the world and the planet on which we live. And that has led us to where we are. We don't have proper health insurance that we need in this country because of insurance companies, we don't have responsibility legislation because of manufacturers. We do not have a healthy environment because of fossil fuel companies and oil companies. We don't have healthier food because of chemical companies and food companies. And we don't have a foreign policy based on moral leadership so much as on sales to people like the Saudi Arabian prince because of defense contractors. And that's where we are. Now, in 1776, we repudiated aristocracy. And aristocracy was a situation, as we know, where only a few people were entitled to win. A few people in the landed gentry were entitled to own houses and land and get educated and make their dreams come true, and nobody else could. We basically reverted. We have this corporate aristocracy of the health insurance companies and the big pharmaceutical companies and the gun manufacturers and the food industry and the defense contractors. First, they get their short-term profits. And then everybody else. So what this trickle-down economic theory, what they said at the time was that they would get more money and then they would create jobs. And they would create jobs and so all that money would trickle down and lift all boats, they said. Well, after 40 years, I think the jury's in. It did not lift all boats. It has left millions and millions of people without a life vest. It has left those 93 million people living in chronic economic anxiety. It has created a situation where 1% of Americans own more wealth than the bottom 90% of Americans. This is very unstable. Whether you're rich or you're poor, this is unstable. This is not stable, and this is not democratic. There's a late Supreme Court justice who said you can have large amounts of money concentrated in the hands of a few, or you can have democracy. You cannot have both. Now, we repudiated aristocracy in 1776. It's time for us to repudiate it again. It turns out that the American Revolution is an ongoing process. Now, I'm not anti-capitalist. This is not an anti-capitalist argument at all. Some very, very successful capitalist leaders, people like a man named Ray Dalio, people like Jeremy Grantham, even the people who are behind this very big capitalist organization called the Business Roundtable said the other day, short-term profits should no longer be the goal. This is not a moment, this is not rich versus poor. Not every rich person in America is a greedy bastard. That's not what's going on here. It's a system itself that all of us as Americans need to realize that American capitalism and American government must reclaim its conscience. That we should not be, our bottom line should not be an economic bottom line. Our bottom line should be a democratic bottom line. It should be about democracy and about humanitarian values. We have to shift from a paradigm from what has become an economic organizing principle to a humanitarian organizing principle. And that is why I'm here. It is time for the humanitarians and the lovers and the seekers and the healers. It is time for the scientists and the teachers. It is time for people who know that in the 21st century, we don't see the world as a machine. We have an integrative, holistic, whole person perspective. You start with relationships with people. You start by taking care of people. All public policy should be based on one core principle. What would help people thrive? If you want a healthy society, if you want a happy society, if you want a prosperous society, help people thrive. It's a lie that's been sold to us. That which would most help people thrive, we're told we can't afford. This is just a huge illusion. You know, so many people in rooms like this have read books like A Sociopath Next Door. And you get, it sounds right, but you figure out, no, it's not right. And it's like a sociopathic economic system. There's no empathy there. There's no love there. It's all about something other than what you need. And so we need to change this. We need a massive infusion of economic hope and opportunity into the life of the average person. And the economics of that are not complicated. You repeal a 2017 $2 trillion tax cut where 83 cents of every dollar went to the richest individuals and corporations. You put back in the middle class tax cut. You stop corporate subsidies. Like last year, we gave $26 billion in corporate subsidies alone to oil and gas. These people are making billions, and we know what they're doing. $26 billion. You know what Martin Luther King used to say? He said, if they give it to poor people, they call it a handout. If they give it to rich people, they call it a subsidy. We need to say, we need to recognize that the U.S. government has actually agreed, gave away its right to negotiate with big pharmaceutical companies for the right to lower drug prices at a time when the Americans in this country can't afford their insulin. And our military, I certainly, my father fought in World War II, and I have a lot of respect for the U.S. military. This critique is not of the military. This critique is of the political decisions that are made. I think the military should have every dollar that it says it needs to protect us. But we spend hundreds of billions of dollars on top of what they say they need just to increase short-term profits for defense contractors. That needs to stop. That, for instance, is why I want a United States Department of Peace. We need to do as much. I'm sure there are people in here. I'm sure there are people in this room who are teachers, who are elementary school teachers, who are social workers, who are early childhood experts. You know, every time you see a military person, and we understandably and rightfully say thank you for your service, every time you see an elementary school teacher, you should say thank you for your service. Because if we really want a healthy economy and a healthy society 10 years from now, we would do more for our 10-year-olds today. We know things. We know things about the human brain we didn't even know 50 years ago, about what happens in the brain of a child before 8 years old. But we have millions of chronically traumatized children. We have children, and here in South Carolina, I don't get it. You had $1 billion surplus, and you had a governor who denied Medicaid expansion. Now, I've seen in South Carolina the extraordinary governor schools. The governor, has everybody seen? Because if you come from South Carolina, you should see this. This is your tax money paying for this, and you should be proud of this. The governor's schools in South Carolina of humanities and the arts, it's amazing. It's like, I want to be here every day. Of technology and science, it's amazing. But when you go to these schools, it's both totally inspiring and totally heartbreaking at the same time. Totally inspiring because, wow, this is what every American child, wow, this is what education could be. and heartbreaking because you have what, 280 students in each one. If I'm president, I want every school in America to be a palace of learning, a palace of culture, and a palace of the arts. You know what? You have that. You just cut out a lot of your mental health issues right there. You cut out a lot of your societal dysfunction right there. You cut out a lot of your health issues right there. And you cut out a lot of your violence issues right there. You front end it. Front end it. Now that's not just incremental change. That's a kind of change that comes from an awakening, the kind of which we're talking about here today, which is it's a whole different paradigm. It's a whole different paradigm, but nothing short of that will turn this ship around. So I want a United States Department of Children and Youth. I met early in the campaign, I met in Greenville with some social justice workers. I met some people who work in poverty issues in South Carolina, children, amazing, social workers, educators. We have throughout this country the people and the best practices and the projects that we need to fix everything. This is true with our children. This is true with our peace building. This is true with the environment. The problem is not that these people do not exist. The problem is that that's not what we fund. So when I ask people in South Carolina, and this is almost eerie to me, because I get the same answer in every state I ask. When I meet with people who do the trauma-informed education, this is what we need. It's so much bigger than just the education department. It's so much bigger than just HHS. It's a whole array of how we treat our children. We need trauma-informed education. We need community wraparound services. We need mental health services, not only for the children, but for their parents. We need conflict resolution. We need trauma-informed education. We need anti-bullying. We need violence prevention. We need mindfulness in the schools. And there are people who know how to do all of that. And they're here in your states as well, South Carolina, North Carolina. Those people are everywhere. But when I ask of the children that need you, because sometimes they'll say we do these great things, and then the kids, and everything is so much better with this child. And I'll say, of the children that need this, how many are you able to reach? This is what's amazing to me. I hear the same numbers every time, 10 to 15%. We have 13 million hungry children in the United States, the richest country in the world. We have 43 million hungry. A lot of these children who are obese are actually malnourished. They keep eating, trying to get some nourishment. We have 13 million hungry children in the United States. We have children in the United States who are traumatized before preschool. Everybody's talking about universal preschool. Great. But some of these kids have terrible behavioral problems even before preschool. I meet so many elementary school teachers, and some of them might even be in this room, who say, I can't take it anymore. I was educated to be an educator, not to be a behavioral therapist. These kids are just dumped onto the laps of our teachers. We have millions of American children who live in what's called, the very fact that this phrase exists, America's domestic war zone. Where psychologists tell us that the PTSD of these children is as severe as the PTSD of a returning veteran from Iraq or Afghanistan. Does not conscience lead us to rescue these children no differently than if they were the victims of a natural disaster? And why hasn't our political system already done this? I'll tell you why. Because they're not old enough to vote. So they're not considered a constituency. And they're not old enough to work. So they don't have any financial leverage. So if Washington is dominated by the undue influence of corporate money, what chance do these children have to compete with the clout of that corporate money? Who is going to intervene if not you and me? Who is going to intervene? I remind you that the abolitionist movement did not begin with the governments. The government didn't wake up one day and say, let's end slavery. It began with the abolitionist movement. People rose up. People stepped in. And same with the women's suffragette movement. It didn't begin with a bunch of people in the government who said, let's give women the right to vote. That's not what happened. With the women's suffragette movement, people rose up and people stepped in. And with the civil rights movement, it didn't happen because the government said we're going to fix it. With the civil rights movement, people rose up and people stepped in. It is absurdly naive for us to think the political establishment is going to repair itself, ladies and gentlemen. It is a status quo, and status quos only seek to perpetuate itself. That's how a status quo operates. If this is going to change, if we are going to move from an economic to a humanitarian bottom line, if we are going to get the money out of politics, if we are going to rescue America's traumatized children, if we are going to have a World War II level mass mobilization to reverse climate change, if we are going to pay reparations for the historical trauma and give economic remuneration both to black people in America and to deal with the issues of historical trauma with Native Americans, and if we are going to wage peace and not just endlessly prepare for war, if we are going to have any kind of fundamental changes in the direction of a moral repair in this country, it won't be because people whose careers have been entrenched for decades within the system as it is said that they'll improve things with a tweak here or a tweak there. If we're going to change, it's going to be because in our generation, we do what other generations have done. The people need to rise up, and the people need to step in. So look how this works. So the system says to someone who would say that, she's unqualified. Right? Like it has to be someone whose career is entrenched in the car that drove us into this ditch that we're supposed to trust to drive us out of the ditch. First of all, this whole idea, I love the idea of an outsider candidate. Outside what? This is America. Remember, all men are created equal thing, and the Constitution says to be president, you have to have been born here, you have to have lived here for 14 years, and you have to be 35 or older. The Constitution doesn't say you have to be a governor, a senator, or a congressman, because they were leaving it to every generation to determine for itself the skill set that that generation feels is most necessary to navigate the times in which we live. That's why Franklin Roosevelt said that the primary responsibility of the presidency is moral leadership. The problem is not that we don't have good car mechanics. We have some excellent political mechanics in Washington, and many of whom are running for president. That's not the problem. The problem is we're on the wrong road. You don't necessarily ask your car mechanic, even the best car mechanic, can you tell me what road to take to Mississippi? It's not a lack of experience. Very experienced politicians took us into Iraq. Very experienced politicians agreed with that horrendous decision. Very experienced politicians took us into Vietnam. We don't lack experience of that kind so much as we lack moral certitude. We lack an alignment of public policy with doing the right thing. That which makes short-term profits for huge multinational conglomerates may or may not mean doing the right thing. And that's why you rescue these children, not because it's going to make immediate corporate profits, because you do the right thing. You don't leave children in that kind of humanitarian disaster. It's not about corporate profits. But the ironic thing, of course, is that doing the right thing always makes things better in the long run. If you want to have a healthy economy 10 years from now, that's what you do, take better care of these 10-year-olds today. Where do you think these children are going to be in 20 years? And the same with mass mobilization. We need a mass mobilization to reverse climate change. And I want a United States Department of Peace because the peace builders should be lifted to the same level of power in our national security agenda as is the military. So what I'm here to talk to you about is a kind of change that is disruptive. It is disruptive, however, in a way that we must change, because if we do not change, you know, there's a line in the Course in Miracles that says, it is not up to you what you learn. It is merely up to you whether you learn through joy or through pain. This country is going to change. We can change wisely, or we can change because so much dysfunction, we're really talking now. We're not just talking about how functional things have moved to dysfunctional. We're talking about dysfunctional having moved to malfunctional. We're in malfunction. We're not just in dysfunction. When you're talking about 12 years left to make serious changes in climate, or else within 20 years we could have a level of mass social unrest, not just unrest, collapse. Yeah. We could have huge swaths of continents uninhabitable because of the heat. Mm-hmm. And if a swath of a country or a continent is uninhabitable because of the heat, that means you can't grow food there. So if you can't grow food there and you can't live there because of the heat, those means those people will be leaving. That's called refugees, environmental refugees, which could be hundreds of millions. Right now we have 63 million displaced persons. Right now, which is the hugest humanitarian disaster since World War II. Right now we know what's happening at the border. Multiply that. It would be beyond, we would have economic collapse on a level we can't even imagine. We would have food shortages on a level we can't even imagine. This is malfunctional. This is not dysfunctional. For us not to rise to the occasion and deal with this and have that World War II level mass mobilization, to move from a dirty economy to a clean economy, to have a just transition where everyone is taken care of, and we do this wisely and we navigate this very tenderly and with great respect for everybody's job. We can do it that way now. We still have time to do this carefully so that it's change but not chaos. But if we refuse to make the change wisely, carefully, quickly, the change will be forced upon us chaotically down the road. The reason I want reparations for slavery is because I want to end one aberrational chapter of American history. That is what we should do. Just end a certain some chapters. Let's begin a new one. Let's begin a new one. But you can't, whether you're a country or a person, you can't have the future you want unless you're willing to clean up the past. Catholics go to confession. The holiest day of the year in the Jewish calendar is Yom Kippur. It's the Day of Atonement. In AA, you have to take a serious moral inventory. You have to admit the exact nature of your character defects. Racism's been a character defect from the beginning. And I don't want to minimize the sacrifices, the struggles, or the successes of any of our ancestors, black or white. But there's still some work to be done here. And in some ways, we're even sliding backwards. Mass incarceration, racial disparity in criminal sentencing, mandatory minimums, voter suppression. Now, Germany has paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations since World War II. Now, that doesn't mean the Holocaust didn't happen, and it doesn't mean reparations fixed everything, but it's gone far towards establishing reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Europe. And that is why I believe we should pay reparations for slavery. And I believe that we could pay it. My plan is for a reparations council made up themselves of descendants of American slaves from a broad array of culture and academia and business and politics. The money, what I proposed is $500 billion to be paid over a period of 20 years. And the stipulation on the part of the US government would be that the money is to be used for purposes of economic and educational renewal. So the stipulation is economic and educational renewal. Within that, how the money is dispersed over 20 years should be up to black people. It should not be up to white people. If I owe you money, I don't get to tell you how to spend it. So when people talk about race-based policies, it's the same paternalism. I mess with you and I'm going to tell you how to fix you. We got to stop it, right? Whereas if the stipulation means a lot of money, certainly the U.S. government, that means all of us have a right to know that money is within economic educational renewal, because that's what reparations are. But within that, then that's will carry what reparations do that race-based policies don't do, is they carry moral force. Race-based policies provide some economic restitution, and it's good. I'm not saying let's not. I mean, all those ideas are you know, where it could be money for historical black colleges or investment in home ownership. All of those ideas are good, but they're external allopathic remedies. They don't deal with cause. This is the 21st century. We need to be holistic. We need to be integrative. We need to be whole person. So when it comes to racial tension in America, we need to do more than just address the symptoms. And so what mea culpa, the thing about reparations is there is an inherent mea culpa. There's an inherent acknowledgement of a wrong that was done, a debt that is owed, and a willingness on the part of a people to pay it. And I know I'm in an area of the country where you know the history. And certainly every black person knows the history, but I think a lot of white people, it's not like I don't think the average American is racist. I don't, actually. I don't. But I think the average American is vastly undereducated. They don't really know all the history, or they learned it in the 7th grade. So when you see it, the first slave ships in 1619, slavery not over till 1865, that's 250 years. Slavery. And that was followed, except for the 12 years of Reconstruction, was followed by another 100 years of institutionalized violence against black people. Lynchings and Ku Klux Klan, what's that if not domestic terror? And I think we would all agree that if you have kicked someone to the ground, and 350 years of institutionalized violence is certainly kicking someone to the ground, you owe them morally 2 things. Number 1, stop kicking.
Yeah. Yes.
And number 2, would you not be responsible for saying, here, let me help you get back up?
Yes.
And I think a lot of people haven't really put together, Tecumseh Sherman promised, the historians believe there were between 4 and 5 million people who had been enslaved persons at the end of the Civil War. And they were promised, every former slave family of 4 was promised, as we all know, 40 acres and a mule, which would have given people the chance to start over. After Reconstruction, the promise was rescinded. And so that economic gap was never closed. Let's close it. It's an economic stimulus to do that, by the way. It's an economic stimulus to do that. There was a study very recently that if black families earned as much as white, our economy would be $1.5 trillion larger. Wow. Anytime, this is the thing about public policy that helps people thrive. It helps everybody. If we say to young people, these college loans are canceled, all that's going to do is make our economy bigger. All it's going to do is say to people, go be brilliant. Go do your thing. Everybody's going to be better off. We have to get over the idea that money is created by a bunch of corporate aristocrats who drop crumbs from the table from their Mount Olympus in the form of job creation. That's not where money comes from. Money comes from the creativity and productivity of the American people. That's where money comes from. People living their dreams. People doing what they want to do. People being happy. They're better employers, better employees, able to raise your children. This is where peace comes from, and this is where prosperity comes from. But you can see it's a whole paradigm shift. So you need a president, I believe we need a president who gets the whole paradigm shift and knows that we need to move a big ship. We need this level of change, but without chaos. It has to be navigated very carefully. People who are going to stay away from the whole shift, then we're still just delaying. We're still delaying the bigger issue. And the peacebuilding thing, this is the final thing I'll say about the peacebuilding thing. I want everybody here to know something. I think a lot of people, so much about politics is talking about the trees, but not talking about the forest. We need in the body politic and on the planet the same thing we have in the health and wellness space. You don't just take medicine, you cultivate your health. And you can't just endlessly prepare for war and hope you'll back up into peace. You have to cultivate peace. And you cultivate peace by expanding educational opportunity for children, by expanding economic opportunities for women, by reducing violence against women, and by ameliorating unnecessary human suffering. Those are the 4 factors which, when present, statistically mean there will be a higher level of peace and a lower level of conflict. Desperate people should be seen as a national security risk because desperate people do desperate things. Desperate people are more vulnerable to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces. That's why, as president, I would want a Department of Peace so that the people within the State Department, such as USAID, which is long-term development and humanitarian assistance, have as much power at the table of our national security as does the military and those others. Now, I want to take questions and comments, whatever you want to talk about, but I will say this. When I said to you a few minutes ago, the lovers need to stand up now, the humanitarians need to stand up now, the teachers need to stand up now, the moms need to stand up now. All of us who know that doing the right thing and love and conscience is what matters most, we need to recognize as citizens, we have not just the right, we have the responsibility to weigh in here. We're the immune system. Someone like a president without conscience, without empathy, is just an opportunistic infection. It couldn't have gotten hold of us had we ourselves not had a weakened societal immune system. And if all we do is elect another president but don't make this fundamental shift, then that same force will be back in the midterms in 22 and in 24. This is so much bigger than not going over the cliff. We have to get out of the vicinity of the cliff. It is the 21st century. And we all learned as kids, when any animal, any species, behaves in ways that are maladaptive for its survival, it evolves or it goes extinct. Yes. You know, most of us in this room have had the experience of someone that we knew who needed an intervention. Mm-hmm. They were drinking too much or they were taking drugs too much. And we all know in modern America, because this is such a common experience, unfortunately, we've all learned the hard way from knowing people who died that the survival of the physical body could not be guaranteed. We're very sophisticated about that. When anybody in this room, you hear that somebody, did you see her at the party last night? Yeah, I saw, she fell down the stairs, yeah, I saw. Do you think we ought to do something? Everybody knows what that means now. Well, we are in magical thinking if we think the survival of our democracy can be guaranteed. And at this point, the way we're treating the earth, we're in magical thinking if we think the survival of the species can be guaranteed. We need an intervention. Yes. And we, the people, are the ones to do it. When hatred and soullessness and lack of empathy and lack of conscience and racism and bigotry and homophobia and anti-Semitism and those kinds of forces are being so loud, love cannot afford to just whisper. And those things are convicted now, and conviction is a force multiplier. A lot more people love than hate, but those of us who love need to love now with the same level of conviction as do those who hate. And we're ready. We've partied. None of us can say we didn't get to go to the party. And none of us can say, there's nobody in the room. I didn't say anything today that you didn't already know. And that's what we all have to face. I might have said some details. No, this is not an era of data collection. We know this. This is not a time to wake up. No, we can wake up. This is a time to own what we know and to do something about what we know. This is not a time just to talk about love. This is not just time to talk about love. This is time to rise up and act on love. This is time to go to yoga, and then after yoga, go kick ass. Thank you. Thank you.